तो बोलने से सब होगा।
यार
എത്ര രൂപയാണ് ഈ സാധനം ചെയ്യുന്നതിന്? RT-PCR ചെയ്യുന്നതിന്?
Hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, Vishu, we can hear you.
I think we can start now. But I think I lost the share screen, right? Are you able to see the screen now?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Okay, excellent. So let us start now. It's 2:05. Okay. Okay, thanks everyone for joining the snack again. So in the next couple of hours, 2 to 3 hours, I'm going to talk about broadly the subject of ecology. Ecology is a really massive area of science, and 3 hours will not be ever sufficient to do justice. So obviously there is no way I'm going to cover a whole lot, so much stuff in just 3 hours. So the way I have planned these as follows. Okay, so the purpose of this part of the workshop is more of discussion rather than sort of giving a very broad lecture. So I'm going to focus on some basic concepts, thinking, and with a sort of with an emphasis on depth of understanding, and not too much on breadth and facts. Okay, and also on what to a large part, the focus of today's workshop will be on asking questions in ecology, and not what the actual answer is. And to the extent possible, I'll also try to focus on how do we answer these questions in ecology. So asking questions and answering questions. So these are the main sort of points I want to emphasize throughout today. And so because I would really like it to be more of a discussion rather than a lecturing mode, I would really appreciate if you all participate via speaking out or via chats, whichever you're more comfortable with, to the extent possible. Okay, I just want to check whether both Harish and Mihir are around, the student volunteers.
Yes, Vishu.
Okay.
Yes, Vishu.
This is Harish.
Okay. And as you know, there is a chat feature, right, that you can use, and there is also a raise hand feature if you actually want to speak. You're welcome to use either of the features. So the way I have, so there are two broad, topics I want to cover today. Broadly, the ecological thinking, which is basically to think of biology as hierarchical organization across scales. So that's the first topic I want to discuss today. And the second one I want to talk would be some topics in population biology. Okay, so that's the main goal. And so before I do go any further, I actually want to do a small poll. Okay, to which I'm going to ask Harish or Mihir, can you please post the link to the first poll on the chat box? And so what we're going to now do is Harish will post link to a Google poll where you will be asked to answer 2 questions. Okay, and I would like to know what the answers to those questions will be, and then we will then think about what you answered.
I'm just going to copy it.
Sure. Only the first poll, Harish, right now.
Yes.
So I see people are still joining in. And can you also post this on the YouTube? I don't know if there are also people who might be watching over the YouTube. Maybe you can also post the link there.
Sure. I've posted the first form.
So I hope all of you are able to check the link. Okay. So there are 2 questions that we have asked here. Just to get a sense of what do you all think of ecology? What is ecology and who is an ecologist? So the first question is ecology is the study of. There are many choices we have given there. You please pick whichever you think is right. You can pick more than one choice. It's not, it's possible that all of them are correct. So just more than one of them is correct. So please pick as many as you like. Likewise, it is same for the second question. So right now, don't bother with the third question because third question is the descriptive question that takes time. Okay. So answer only the first and second one. Ecology is the study of, and what do ecologists do? Please pick only these two. I'm sorry, the second question, there is something a very funny choice called option 7. Please ignore that. Maybe I can edit that out. Okay, I just did. So let us take 2 minutes. There's 2:12 on my clock right now. I'm hoping that, so as soon as I see that there are about 50 people who have responded, I will take a look at what all did you respond. So to those of you who joined late, please look at the chat box. There is a link to a Google form. Please go to that Google form, and there are 2 questions that we would like you to answer. Okay. First and the second one. Ignore the third one, which is a descriptive question for now. Please answer those 2 questions, and once sufficient number of you have responded, I will go through it to see what you have to say. Okay, I have received some 40 responses now. So maybe I can start looking at it. Okay, 42. Let me wait for a couple of more minutes. Okay, and then I will, if it is just 50, I'll start looking at what people have to say. Okay, I'll share the answers by people so far. What do people say? Let's see, what do people say. I will share the screen where there are people are have given their answers. So this is the response to the Google poll. So of the 47 responses, 13 of you are saying ecology is the study of environmental pollution and their effects. Okay. And the maximum answer everybody has picked, almost everyone has picked that ecology is the relationship between living organisms and its environment. Okay. Okay, so that seems like, nobody has doubt that ecology is this, but there is in the wild. Okay, that's 25% also say that. Natural resource management, a lot of you think that ecology is the study of natural resource management. Interesting. How atmospheric gases affect global temperature, environmental pollution and effects, finding ways to reduce environmental pollution, and discovering and characterizing new species. So okay, so there's a thing like, there is no hard boundary where ecology starts and ends. Ecology is relevant to all of these questions. There is no doubt about it. All of these areas, ecology has a lot of relevance. But if you were to sort of go by ecology as something that sort of widely accepted, clearly ecology is the study of relationship between living organisms and the environment. That's absolutely right. Going to the first choice, environmental pollution and their effects, is often not the not the primary thing that at least the ecologists do. It might be one of the questions that ecologists might study. For example, how does pollution affect species and community compositions? Absolutely yes, but that I would say is not the primary sort of study of ecology. Finding ways to reduce environmental pollution, one can say with a much more confidence that this is typically not an ecological study. This is an important study, no doubt. Okay. Discovering and characterizing new plants and animals is again is a very important part, and knowing new plants and animals is very important. And in fact is often an offshoot of many of the ecological research, especially those who study evolution and who study the distribution of species, often do discover new plants and animal species. Forests, lakes, and species in the wild only. Do I say wild only in the end? I don't remember that. If the question actually said it's wild only in the wild only. Okay, so ecologists do study interactions between organisms, even in it doesn't have to be in the wild only. It could also be in a urban setting. It could also be in a semi-wild conditions. So half of you have picked that natural resource management is ecology. Natural resource management, I would think, is a lot more complex than just ecology in some sense. Of course, you do need to know very good ecology to manage natural resources. But natural resource management is not the primary study that ecologists do. And the last option, around 22% have we picked again, how atmospheric gases affect global temperature. This is again not something ecologists study. Ecologists study the effect of global temperature changes on various biological interactions. But they don't study how atmospheric gases, for example, increasing carbon dioxide, increases, global temperature. That's typically the study of, of physicists and atmospheric scientists and so on. Okay, so it's interesting to see this distribution of answers. As I said, there's strictly it's difficult to define boundaries. Ecology is a highly interdisciplinary science. Historically, it has been closely linked to geology, and more recently in social sciences when you think of conservation research. So it's a widely interdisciplinary field. And what do ecologists do? Invent. So 30% of we have. So let's look at the maximum answer. A majority of we have said studies one or more. Okay, unfortunately, I can't see the questions fully here. One or more aspects of an organism found inside a forest. Okay, ecologists do study organisms inside the forest using computer simulations. Focus about ecological scenarios. Absolutely, yes. A large number of you have picked this option 2. Develop sensors to measure air and water pollution. This ecologists almost surely can't, because ecologists are often trained in biology, and developing sensors requires skills of engineers and physics. Ecologists do only observational study inside national park and and reserve for but very few of you have picked this. Ecologists, as I also indicated in the previous answer, do study in the laboratory as well. You can do ecological studies within the lab, and ecologists develop mathematical theories of biological phenomena. Absolutely true. Okay, so you could know these wide-ranging answers. Ecologists invent ways of managing solid waste. This is often the field of environmental sciences, not quite ecological sciences. Okay, so so it's useful to know this, because we when we meet people, when I personally meet a lot of people, often people confuse ecologists to be environmental scientists. Always I keep on sometimes blurred, and there are no strict boundaries. Understanding ecology is very important for environmental sciences, but ecologists primary research area or interests are not in studying issues of environmental sciences and natural resource management. Okay, so that's the I just want to have this quick poll to sort of see where we all stand. What do you understand by ecology? I'm now going to go back to my presentation. Okay. Okay, so let me now go to the next slide. Let me ask you the following question. I've showed you one simple picture here, and I'm basically going to ask you, based on this picture, you're seeing, I think this is probably from Tiranga, if I'm right. So you're seeing rhinos and a flock of birds. Okay, and okay, something happened here. Let me just unshare and share it back. Is it fine now? Okay, so I would now like to know, we have just discussed what are the different, what is the what is ecology, and what do ecologists study. Okay, now I would like you to think of what are the different ecological questions that one studies in that you can that comes to your mind. For example, if you are in a national park like this in Kaziranga, what do you think are the interesting ecological questions one can study? So I would like you to use the chat box to give me some answers. Don't worry if they're right or wrong. I just want to hear, for example, if you are today in, if you are right now, imagine yourself in a national park like this, beautiful national park. What would you like to study? What will you study? Want a more specific answer? You are somebody saying about interactions, population size over years or generations. Good. Let me just try to use this one. Okay, hold on for a second. Somehow just need to enable this pointer options. 10. Okay. So you will study I want something more specific. These are all broad areas of ecology. Which population do you want to study? Mohanish Singh, maybe you can answer by chat box again. Which population do you want to study? Somebody saying coexistence of creatures. Okay. Plant animal interactions. Okay, excellent. Okay. And somebody saying again, spatio-temporal changes, but changes in what? Population of rhinos over years. Okay, fine. One can study, right? Time. Okay. And then people are asking, how do species coexist, right? Coexistence of. So when you say coexistence of species, can you tell me, or you think of coexistence of rhinos and this flock of birds? What are you thinking? So lots of general points I'm seeing here, but I'm thinking of slightly more specific questions. Coexistence of humans and animals. Okay. Coexistence of species, mutualism. Okay, between, somebody said rhinos and birds. Okay, maybe I don't know if it actually exists between the specific rhinos and birds you're seeing, but yeah, maybe they do. Okay, egrets. Okay. Somebody said metapopulation, but invasive species. Okay, movement patterns, habitat use, endemism, lots of by behavioral and biochemical changes in marine system. We're not in the marine ecosystem here. This is a terrestrial ecosystem. So somebody said seasonal changes in behavior. Okay, that's good. So maybe you're thinking of, I'm going to write that here. Behavior. I please apologize for extremely bad handwriting. I'm still learning how to use this virtual blackboard and whiteboard and pens. Mutualism in ecosystems. Okay, ecosystem services. Okay, excellent. Already quite a bit of variation of questions here, and the one thing I want to emphasize here is is the following. Here there is a question on the behavior of individuals. So my laptop is complaining that I have very poor internet, so maybe I should I'll just switch on the video. Hold on for a second. Okay. I have switched off my video to avoid uh, okay. So I'm still figuring out how to use these, pads and all. So that's why I'm messing up a bit. So, there is a nice gradation of questions here. I know up typing more questions. That's really great. You're all doing really well on the front. Here is an example of seasonal changes in the behavior of rhinos, an individual species, and we want to study their behaviors across seasons. Maybe behavior could be feeding behavior, maybe mating behavior, and other sorts of behaviors, various behaviors. Now, and then the another question from the picture, inspired by picture again, is how do these rhino populations or the bird populations, how are they changing over time? Okay, so while this was at the level of individual behavior, this is an example of question of populations. And then if you go further, and this is a question of a single population. Of course, you can study rhino populations over time. You can even study elephant populations in the same landscape over time. You can study bird populations over time, or maybe even insect species. However, then we come to the third question here, which is more of to study this, it is insufficient to study single species. You also need to look at multiple species. How do two species, when you look at the questions of coexistence, you look at species who have very similar ecologies. Okay. But you then wonder what makes them coexist, because if the ecology of species competing with one another, okay, what makes them coexist? So coexistence of species would be another question. So now we have moved from behavior of an individual species to populations to multiple species populations. How do multiple species coexist? And then, of course, so when we say why do multiple species coexist, we often have competition between species in mind, because if very similar species are together, they will try whoever is slightly more competent can outcompete the other, and and that can lead to the slightly less competent one being displaced. So however, in this fourth question is also about interaction between species, but one is looking at what are the various ways animals interact in a positive way, while competition is a negative interaction between species. Here we're looking at positive interactions between species. One example is that of mutualism. There were also many suggestions looking at plant animal. This is an example of animal interaction that somebody wrote. And then moving further, one can look at ecosystem dynamics. Of course, ecosystem services is only one part of ecosystem dynamics. Ecosystems, when we move from multiple species to ecosystem, we also pay a lot of attention to understanding what are the various abiotic factors. It could be biogeochemical cycles that are important for the entire system functioning. One can ask questions about the structure of ecosystem, function of ecosystem, and the services that they provide. Okay, so there are, this whole range of questions that ecology consists of. And this provides us sort of a framework to think what questions to ask in ecological context. Okay, I don't think I have much here in these questions. So, we have now discussed, I have broadly discussed two what is ecology and what do we study in ecology, right? I hope that has given you some ecology. Many of us think is, I'm just trying to summarize whatever you have just said and whatever I have written down. We can study all the way from individual behaviors and traits of organisms. It could be animals, plants, microbes. Okay, and we study interactions between organisms such as competition, mutualism, parasitism, and so on. And then not only interactions between organisms, we study these in the context of their abiotic environment, and also in the evolutionary context. And this is really important. This goes back to what Professor Karthik Shankar covered, very giving a wide range of evolutionary phenomenon. And evolutionary phenomena basically provides historical contingency and how ecology functions. Many species are there where they are because of evolutionary history of that place. So it is really important to understand the evolutionary context as well when we are looking at ecology. And all these above interaction and processes, right? When we understand interaction between organisms, and when we understand behavior of organisms and put them in the context of their geography and evolutionary history, we begin to understand how are species distributed in space. How are species, and under the given space, what are the relative compositions of various species? And moving on, we can then understand how do populations and communities change over time. I know no population or community stays same, and there are very important processes through which populations and communities change over time. And how does our understanding of individual behavior of organisms and interactions between organisms, together with the environmental and evolutionary contexts, explain how populations and communities change over time. Moving beyond communities, there are ecosystems, and of course, moving beyond ecosystems, we have biomes. Right? Biome is basically a collection of all the ecosystems that we see in the world. And so this leads us to the hierarchical organization and scales in ecology. This picture starting. And then you move on from individual groups and populations in this next, something happened. Okay. To populations, and then you have communities where multiple species interact with one another, right? And then you have ecosystems, and finally the entire biome. And this is a really understanding this hierarchical organization and scale is very important. And provides a framework for us to think about ecology. So now having provided this, framework, before I move on, I'll now provide an example. My next goal is to provide another example, and to discuss more. In the meantime, are there more questions? Any questions that people would like to ask, or any comments that you would like to say?
Vishu, your video is turned off. Do you want to turn it on?
Because it says that the network was a bit bad, which is why I turned it off.
That's fine. That's fine. Then let it be.
Is it? I mean, if it complains again, I will turn off my video again.
Makes sense. Makes sense.
Okay. Any questions? Any comments before I move forward? So there is one question by Mohnish: where does the role of diversity indices come in ecology? So when we study biodiversity, right, when we look at community ecology or ecosystem ecology, you want to know which communities have higher diversity, right? Is it a grassland community or is it a tropical forest community, for example? And then you say you want to compare two tropical forest communities and you want to compare the diversity, biodiversity. And that's where the diversity indices come into picture in ecology. And there are a variety of diversity indices, as you are probably aware of, and they're all fairly well explained in, various uh, textbooks. So, for example, the simplest one being, just look at species richness, the number of species in a given area, right? In a given, given natural area. And then that, however, doesn't capture the fact that some species might be much more in number, some species might be highly abundant, whereas some species might be very, very rare. And therefore the species richness is a very crude measure of diversity. Then there are measures like Shannon index and so on that sort of tries to overcome the limitations. And that's basically to understand biodiversity is where the role of biodiversity indices are very important. Other questions, comments? Harish, do you also want to check YouTube just in case there are some chat questions there?
There are a few, Vishu.
Mihir is doing. Yeah, Mihir,
sure,
you can shoot the questions.
Yeah.
Do you want me to read them out or should I
Yeah,
just
you can
paste
read them out. Both of them would be fine. Yeah.
Okay.
So I will not be able to go to YouTube and check though myself.
So Vishu, I'll just paste them in the chat box so that by the time you answer, I'll check for other questions.
So there's the first question. Can you please tell me if coevolution occurs always in a particular environment between organisms? Then how prey-predator interactions occur? I don't think I understood the question fully. Yes, coevolution occurs whenever there are two species that are interacting. Can potentially occur whenever there are interacting species. And in fact, predators and prey do both evolve. Prey evolve to evade from predators, evolve to improve their efficiency of capture. So both of them evolve. Predators, for example, both of them evolve various strategies to increase their own survival. So coevolution does occur in interacting species. I don't know if I fully understood the question, but this was my interpretation. Should I wait, Mehida, to go forward, or does environment outside the interacting species affect their coevolution? Okay. Does environment outside? So the question is not fully clear. So there are, are you saying that let's say there are two species that are interacting and maybe they are co-evolving? Are you asking that the environment that they live in influences coevolution or not? Is that what the question is? I guess the environment they live in does put in various constraints and on how they evolve. For example, if they are grassland species, again think of predators and prey. The kind of strategies they both evolve and co-evolve would be different. Compared to, let's say, prey interacting species in a maybe in a forest area where there is no open where there is huge canopy, there are very few. So I would imagine that the environment they live in will influence how they also co-evolve. Okay, so I can keep on taking questions as we go forward. Uh, so let me now maybe go back to my slides. Okay, so so I want to give this example of locust swarms. Okay, so I'm sure many of you have heard about this, and I find this example really fascinating for many reasons. Okay, so locust swarms. This is a picture on the right hand side is a picture from Panna Tiger Reserve sometime last year. As you may be familiar, last year the locust swarms reached India, and in fact as much into Panna Tiger Reserve, and it was, I don't think it reached Karnataka, but I think it was certainly there in some parts of Maharashtra. And these locust swarms basically arise from desert locusts, and these swarms can contain several billions of individuals, and they can really destroy crops as they move. Okay. In the next slide, I'm going to show you a video. I hope the video works. Okay, I hope you're able to see the video. Where did they come from? Where do the locusts that we sort of swarms that we see come from? In a bad year, they can, these locust swarms can really travel continental distances. I'm not saying that the locust that was born in the Western Africa will actually reach the Thar Desert. I'm not saying that, but the locusts, there are of course a lot of turnover over time. A lot of individuals die and the new individuals are born. But the swarm as a whole, if you were to think of it as some super organism, can actually really extend continental scales. And this is a really fascinating but also a destructive phenomenon if you think from an agricultural point of view, because these locusts often destroy the crops on their way. I will post your questions. Ask this simple phenomenon. Tell me, what questions do you want to ask about this? Now, think within the framework of the scales of organization that we just discussed. So I would like you to think, what are the questions that one can ask and one would want to understand, having known that there is such a phenomenon of this massive continental scale locust swarms. So again, post your questions on the chat box. I will see them, So the question I have asked you is to post questions. So the question that I'm asking is, now that I have shown you a phenomenon of locust swarms that travels continental scales, what kind of ecological questions do you want to ask about this phenomenon? Is the question? I hope the question is clear. Okay, one question is, how do billions of to divide parts? So remember, that we discussed about hierarchical organization, right? Okay, so I'm going to going by that. We can. So I'm going to write about the individuals on the left-hand side here. Maybe this is group, and maybe here we have populations. Okay. Populations and beyond. Okay. Okay. Now somebody asked, how, okay, I'll so many questions. How stay together, huh?
How the locusts stay together.
Trigger for swarms. Okay. Macro climatic requirements. Okay. So I'm also going to maybe divide this into, so I will put anything above populations here. Okay. Macro climatic factors. Why do locusts move over large distances? That's a very good question. And in what ways do locusts interact with local species? Okay. So locust interaction with other species, right? Again, please excuse my really bad handwriting. Okay. And then about relatedness. Diet. I don't know where to put diet, maybe here. Competition. Interspecific competition. Okay, do they appear every year? There were lots of questions I have missed out. Okay. How do they affect ecosystems? Effects. I really need to improve my handwriting, huh? And also, there was another very interesting question. Why do they do this? Why swarm? Because it's such an interesting question that I'm going to put it at the top, okay? Can we predict mathematically? I don't know again where to put this. Maybe this could be in the groups or population. Predict mathematically when they swarm, how big they grow. Okay. How do they adapt to changes? Okay, again, maybe that might be in the adaptation to. Okay. Are there some some climatic effects that are favorable conditions? Why do population increase to high numbers? Is it invasive or not? Okay. Predators, something about predators of the species. Oh, sorry, I messed up. How do I stop this? Okay. So does anyone, okay, you don't know how to do that. I don't know how this happened. Somehow this pen is not stopping.
Can you share and unshare, Vishu?
No,
Will
I
that
think,
take away the quiz? Oh.
I think there is an alternative way I'm going to do that. Huh? I think this. Okay. Oh, no, that's not going. I think it has to be. So, before I need to learn some of these techniques, huh? Clearly how to properly share. How do I properly use these tablets? And I appreciate everybody's patience and tolerance of my extremely poor handwriting skills. Okay. And this is, I think my children do better job than this in writing. Okay. So anyway, we can stop the questions now. These are all, really fascinating questions. And, you're all basically asking questions that people have been trying to understand over the last maybe several decades, I think. Okay. So again, when we think of any ecological, why did I give this example? The reason why I thought this was a good example was this was an example of a single phenomenon of locust swarm migration over continental scales, where you can ask questions across scales at the level of individuals. What is it that is triggering swarming, right? And what is the diet of these individuals? What are the adaptations of these individuals to their local environments and as they are moving, right? And when they are moving in groups, what are the relatedness of these individuals? And when they move in groups, how do they actually stay together? Why don't they just disperse into smaller groups and break up into smaller and smaller groups? And how do you see that they all manage to go in the right direction, right? Can we use mathematical techniques to predict strategies of individuals, strategies that the groups as a whole might be adopting? And then we can ask questions at the level of populations. How are these population numbers increasing from small numbers to suddenly a huge pest, right? Of course, by the way, I want to make it clear that there are some ecologists who think that maybe in some cases, these locust swarms should not be really seen like pests, like the way we usually think of as pests. This is a part of a natural ecosystem process, and the damage they cause probably not so as huge as it is made out to be. Okay, that's a topic for separate time. And then what are the, so some people ask questions like, are there triggers at the level of individuals that cause swarming? One can also ask, are there macroclimatic or microclimatic factors that trigger this swarming behavior? And as these locusts are moving, how do they interact with maybe other locust species or maybe any other species? Of course, locusts will have their predators. Locusts probably also prey on some other species. Of course, they eat crops. Maybe they also eat other smaller insects on the way. And while the population is growing and while they are moving, what is the role of interspecific competition? And that's a really important question, right? Because there's a really, really large number of individuals in a population. When the numbers are really large, there is competition between organisms, the same species. So what is the role of interspecific competition? And then, of course, this entire, swarm, what is the impact it has on various ecosystems as they encounter? How do they affect other species, plant species, other animal species? And one can, and of course, agriculture, it has a human impact, human dimension to it, because they sort of are considered huge pests for agriculture, and they are known to destroy agricultural productivity. So this ecological framework of thinking across scales and connection between scales is really useful way to phrase questions in ecology. This does not mean, I want to caution one thing though. Let's say if I want to study group behavior, it doesn't mean that I'm going to divorce from the individual behavior and the consequences at the population level. One must keep the feedbacks and interaction across scales of the organization, and that's really important. And if you don't do that, we might actually miss out very important processes in being able to understand and explain what's happening. Okay, so these are the some questions we can ask. This is great. I have also made my own list of questions, and which sort of roughly reflect what you all told. One can look at individual locusts, and of course, the nice thing about studying individual locusts will be one can also do laboratory studies. One can study their behaviors, interactions, and their habitat and food preferences. And then one can study the group behavior. Again, you can do laboratory studies of group behavior. Of course, those groups will not be in billions, obviously. They will be in much smaller numbers, maybe a few hundreds. And in fact, people have done those. We can ask questions about how do they form groups? Why do they form groups? And of course, from the laboratory studies, we cannot ask how do they navigate such large distances. But for that, you do need field studies. And we do need models for those. Moving from individuals to groups, beyond, one can ask questions at the level of populations and communities. How do they grow in such numbers? And what is the sort of, community that the locusts are part of? What's the structure of the food web? What is the network of interactions in the community of locusts? And for this, again, one can do field work and maybe some laboratory experiments. Okay, and as well as modeling can be very useful for these kind of studies. And finally, one can look at the ecosystem level questions. What are the landscape factors that play a role in these ecosystems? It could be climatic factors. It could be, in fact, there are studies that are arguing that increased greening of deserts, which is happening because of increased irrigation, and to some extent even misguided attempts at forestation in the dry areas, that the locusts are thriving in numbers only because of these greening efforts that has happened. And of course, when we think of ecosystems, there is also an impact of climate change, the changing patterns of weather and water and nutrition availability because of climate change. In addition, of course, it has impacts on agriculture. So one can study all these questions, and what's remarkable, is that you together in this group pretty much came up with every question I have listed here. And in fact, I think there were actually more questions that you had probably posted than my own list of questions here. So the point I want you to take away from this short discussion on locust swarms is, how do we arrive at questions in ecological phenomenon? To understand ecological phenomena would be to think across scales of biological organization. Okay, so now, because we have discussed locusts, let me now tell you a few interesting things about locusts. Having come this far, I think I want to tell you a few very interesting things, some of which you might know much better than I do. So locusts have this really curious and interesting behavior called phase change. It's also called polyphenism. So what happens is the following: when the locusts are in small numbers, when they are on their own, when they don't have too many other individuals around them, they're actually very solitary individuals, and they're actually shy, and they look like this, the picture I am showing you on the right hand side. So that sounds really bizarre, right? Locusts, we always think of locusts as swarms, and which means they have to be social and gregarious. But that happens only when when they are actually in high densities. When the locusts are in large numbers, what happens is they meet each other very frequently, and this interaction, in some sense, it's almost a forced interaction, because they are really, really large in numbers right now, right? So if you take a whole bunch of this green-looking solitary locusts, if you put them in a small enclosed environment, because they will be now bumping into each other very, very frequently, what will happen is that they will actually change their behavior from being solitary and shy to social and gregarious. Not only do they change the behavior, they actually change their morphology as well, from this greenish looking to this shiny colored individual. They actually molt, and they look like this once they become gregarious. So gregarious locusts look like the one below, whereas the solitary locusts look like the one above. Of course, there is much more behavioral plasticity. Now, if you now take a social individual and isolate it for some time, they will again turn back to being solitary. Of course, there are some complicated interactions here. It turns out that if we actually take a female gregarious individual, and the eggs laid by the individual and the offspring that come out of that also often tend to be gregarious. However, the offspring of these shy and solitary individuals will also tend to be solitary. So there is very interesting effects of what the mother experienced that will actually carry forward to the next generation as well. There are very interesting epigenetic effects that happen at the level of individuals due to interaction with other individuals, because of the social environment that they live in. And let me tell you something very interesting. What eventually drives this polyphenism itself, that actually is a really fascinating and very counterintuitive explanation. It turns out that the locusts have this really, almost like a two behavioral phase of solitary and gregarious. And that seems to be happening for a very counterintuitive reason. It seems to be happening because of cannibalistic interaction. So somebody mentioned about intra-specific competition, right? So when these locusts are in very large numbers, they also cannibalize each other. Okay, and it is really to run away from the cannibalism, okay, that they might actually be moving in these forms, in these crazy ways, which sounds very counterintuitive. Why would you want to be in a gregarious phase when you're actually cannibalistic? Okay, so that seems a very counterintuitive phenomenon, but in experimental and modeling studies show that cannibalistic interaction at individual level actually can lead to gregarious swarms. Okay, so one can study these using one can arrive at these kind of inferences using a combination of experimental studies in the laboratory, mathematical modeling studies on computers and mathematics, and also field studies. For example, in this example, what I'm showing you is an experiment done by scientists at Oxford. What they did was they put a whole bunch of locusts in a small arena. Okay. Now, if they were indeed cannibalistic, what would you expect? You would expect that over time they eat each other, right? In fact, nobody actually knew that they were cannibalists. Of course, many insects do cannibalize, that's true, but the role of cannibalism is not often well studied. But what they found interestingly in this study was that individuals, if you do experiment overnight, by the next morning, typically 1 or 2 individuals are not there at all in the experimental arena because other guys have gone together and eaten one of them. So, and interestingly, what happens is that when individuals see that somebody from behind is coming towards them, locusts had a very high chance of moving ahead of them. And the individuals who were blind and who were sort of in the experimental conditions, who were actually blind because they cannot see other individuals coming from behind, they had less movement and they had higher chances of getting injured because of cannibalistic interactions. Okay, so this is one interesting sort of example of how one can study across organizations of ecological complexity using experiments and mathematical modeling and also field studies. So I don't want to go into too much of details because I was giving this as an example. I wanted to mention a couple of interesting aspects. Do you have any questions before I go back to the ecological framework again? Any questions, comments?
Seems to be one question that is asked whether humans are responsible for this particular behavior. If yes, then how? I think this is related to swarming itself.
The locust swarms are fairly well known historically. Whether the recent increased human activities, are they increasing? Will they cause higher chances of locust swarms? That is something people are still studying. One hypothesis is that because we have been greening deserts, dry areas which have relatively less vegetation, which also means that it's difficult for locusts to find food over long distances, right? So naturally under natural conditions. However, erratic rainfalls that might increase the vegetation, together with the fact that irrigation and other human mediated greening of deserts might be one factor which might be increasing this swarming behavior is a hypothesis. I think it's there are no very clear answers yet. And somebody is asking, what is the mode of their movement? They fly. The adults can fly. Of course, the nymphs can walk, but adults can fly. There's another question.
Sir.
Yeah, please. Yes, somebody asking a question. Yes.
Sure, like first time, let's say like now, let's say like they are in solitary now, and now they're getting into like they are forming swarms. So like you said that there will be some genetic changes within them, like morphological changes will be there. So internally there might be some changes. Like let's say some genes have got changed or something happened within them, and so that's how they're becoming, like they're changing their shape, or morphologically they're becoming different.
No, it's not a genetic change. It's actually entirely a plasticity. So plasticity is a change that happens within an individual. They have the same genetic composition before and after. Okay, just like a butterfly egg becomes a larva, pupae, and a adult butterfly, right? That change is happening, right? It's basically exactly that in locusts as well. So changes that you are seeing here is not a genetic change, but it's within a single individual. It's a plastic change. It's plasticity. It's also called, polyphenism. Okay, there are other questions. Newly introduced locusts would I don't understand.
So no, it's the questions below is whether diet could affect the color of the locust.
Okay, it's a very good question. I don't know the answer immediately. There is a very, very good studies done by Professor Steve Simpson. He is currently based in Australia. They have done a lot of studies on nutrition, diet, and locusts. I think that would be the place to look up. In fact, they have really very nicely characterized the nutritional aspects. In fact, locust is used as a model system to study nutrition ecology of animals. But I don't know the specific answer to your question, whether the diet change can cause behavioral change. That I don't remember immediately. But I think the main driver is the density. If the density of individuals change, we know their behavior changes from solitary to gregarious. We know that if you take the hind leg of individuals and rub them, then also their behavior changes, because it is almost like a proxy for high density for them, which is why their behavior changes. And there are certain chemicals that people have identified in their body. If you modify that artificially, then also this behavioral change, phase change happens. I'm not so sure of diet. Oh, the question is, how do offspring affect? It's an epigenetic effect. Okay, so it is, there is a, so basically the experience of the mother sort of carries forward via genes. It's not that the genes themselves are changing, and the offspring exhibit that effect. Somebody, Yogesh is asking, can it change from green to yellow back to green body color as densities change? So green to yellow, I certainly remember that it does change within a single individual. The reverse change, I think, for example, if you take the yellow individual, the gregarious individual, and if you separate them into a low density environment, I don't think that will change back to green. It takes a few generations, 1 or 2, I think, I don't remember exactly now, to get, the offspring will eventually become green. And there is a reason we hypothesized in one of our papers. So to escape from cannibalism, you need to be in that yellow phase, right? The gregarious phase. And cannibalism is obviously a very risky behavior for you might die from somebody else. So once you have acquired that gregarious behavior, it seems like you want to retain it for some time before you switch back to solitary behavior. That's one hypothesis why once they are gregarious, the reverse transition is a bit slow, but transition from solitary to gregarious is quite fast. Quite fast, I think within an individual, in a matter of few hours.
But retaining their original color may put them at risk, right?
Which is why it's slow. Which is why it is a slow behavior. But at low densities, that is the preferred strategy. That is the evolutionarily stable strategy. Next question is, the rate of reproduction is higher than the rate of cannibalism? If the rate of cannibalism is higher, then the numbers will reduce, right? Overall numbers. So if the numbers are increasing, the rate of reproduction has to be greater than the rate of cannibalism. Harish, you wanted to say something?
No. There's a question from YouTube which Mihir posted. So locusts seem to destroy all plants in agriculture. So how did nature select this animal?
See, nature does not care who is doing what. Nature cares only about who survives better than the others, right? So as long as that is taken care of, it doesn't matter. So I guess maybe the question here is, why would an individual species which is destroying its own food source can actually continue, right? But this locust swarms or locust plagues, they don't happen every other day. They happen once in several years. So if you're right that if there was a behavior that would overconsume your resource on a very, very frequent basis, such a species will probably die out, right? However, that's not happening in the case of locusts. Okay. So there are more questions. If you don't mind, I'm going to stop here because I want to move to the next topic. Okay. There are lots of, I'm very happy to answer more questions again later if we have time. So again, I want to revisit just to remind everyone the ecological framework of thinking. Okay. And then I want to switch topics a bit. Okay. So Kishore, please don't mind. I have seen your question, but I will certainly answer this maybe towards the end. Is that fine? Okay. So the way we have described now ecology, starting at the top here, is you can think of ecology as studying, in some sense, behavioral ecology, which looks at the individual level behavior. What is the adaptiveness of the behavior, and what is the fitness consequence of that behavior, and how does this behavior can lead to foraging, swarming kind of behaviors, right? This is the behavioral ecology of individuals and groups. Can you please mute yourself? Thank you. Okay. And then ignore the ecology part here. Ecology could be then, once you have studied individuals and groups, ecology is the study of populations, where we study the abundance of various species. We look at the distribution of various species and how this distribution depends on the individual behaviors. How does it depend on interaction with the larger community, right? This arrow here. And each species, what is their niche? How do they modify the niche? How do they influence their own habitat? And how does the habitat in turn influence the species abundance distributions? And how do these abundance and distribution then change over time? So that's the study of population ecology here. And if you go to the next level, ecology is a community ecology that studies compositions, interactions, organization of various species. And how do these communities change over time? Succession, right? And these entire communities and the interactions that they make are part of the ecosystem. Okay, and where you also not only study all the communities, biological communities, you also look at the flow of energy and matter. Right, basically you study both biological interactions as well as the abiotic factors, how they are influencing interactions, as well as the the entire flow of entire structure of the hierarchical organization. So that's the way, one way to think of ecological framework, from behaviors to populations to community to ecosystems, with lots of feedback all over the place. Therefore, it's also a very difficult discipline. There are many, if you observe a phenomenon, there could be many causal factors. For example, if I'm looking at swarming behavior here in this corner, it might be dependent on community that they are a part of, because the predation impacts, this swarming might be an adaptation to predation, which is a community, predator-prey interaction, and how the predators and prey have co-evolved over time. So, although every part, every corner, every look of this, this flow chart might be influenced by something really far apart. So it's really interconnected set of factors that influence the organization and the properties of ecological phenomena. Okay, so that's what makes ecology both very fascinating and also very difficult to study. So that sort of brings me to the end of the first part of my talk. I would now like to take a 10-minute break and have some water or maybe tea, and I will then talk about a couple of topics in population ecology. As I said, ecology is a really huge field. Should we talk about this? And in fact, that is what Maria Tucker will talk about tomorrow, right? In the morning. And then, and in next week, Umesh will talk about how all the things we study in ecology will actually be very helpful for understanding conservation. Okay, so but for today, for the second half of my talk, I'm going to focus on population ecology. Okay, and how do we understand some basic concepts in population ecology, but we will do this after 10-minute break. So as of now, it's 3:23 in my clock. Let's come back at 3:35. Is that fine? And we don't need to log out, by the way. We'll just stay connected, but because admitting people will take a lot of time again. So we'll just just mute yourselves, stay online, and I'll come back in about exactly 11 minutes. 3:24 now, 3:35 will be back. Hello everyone. I think shall we start again? Okay, so let's start now again. Okay, so as I mentioned in the beginning of the session, I'm going to cover two broad topics. Broadly, how do we think in ecology as via the idea of hierarchical organization of biological systems across scales. Okay, and that I think I have covered now. And thanks so much for participating so nicely with so many questions and so much interactions. I really enjoy it. So now, as I mentioned, in this huge web of what ecology constitutes, I cannot in no way can I cover everything. In fact, understanding ecology often takes 1 or 2 semesters of long courses. Okay, and then you begin to sort of make sense of various concepts and so on. So my goal today is to introduce some basic concepts in population ecology. Hari, do you think it's a good time to post our second poll?
Sure, I'll do that right now.
Yeah, thank you. So Harish will post two questions, another poll now, just to get an understanding of some where all do you currently stand. Okay, Harish has posted the link. So unfortunately, the link, even if I post on the YouTube chat box, it doesn't show up for some reasons. Maybe it's some setting in YouTube. So I don't know what we can do about that.
Vishu, I've asked them to copy paste that link on the browser, and that way it works.
Oh, okay, fine. It's been working
Yeah,
for some people. Okay, very good then. Okay, thanks. So for those of you who may have joined a bit late, please check the chat box. There is a link to another small poll that Harish has posted. Please answer those questions. So take 5 minutes. There is no rush. Let's say, because you need to think through these questions. You may have to think. It's not like a quick, click answer. So 3:39 now. 3:45 is when we will begin our discussion. Okay. So in the meantime, I noticed that there are some questions. Some people want to actually understand some concepts in more detail, especially about locusts. Maybe what I can do is I can send a couple of references by the end of the day today to everyone. That way you can read more about this stuff. So I have received some 27 responses so far. I'm maybe waiting for to cross around 35 or so. So okay, I have received it's almost 3:15 now. I'll just show you what we have found. Okay, so the first question, I know these questions are actually made by Harish Prakash, a student volunteer. Thanks to him, and even the previous set by the Harish and Mihir, both of them. So the first question that we asked was, as a population, human beings have is it a negative growth rate, stagnant, positive, or unknown? Okay, that was the first question. Second one was, endangered species like snow leopard generally have, again, stagnant, positive, negative, unknown growth rates. Okay, and the third question was, so both of them, you hear this word growth rate here, and this growth rate is a really important concept which we will discuss today in the context of population ecology. Okay, and then the third question is, which of the following factors does not affect population growth? Birth rate, death rate, whether or not the population is composed of reptiles or amphibians, and immigration. Okay, and finally, what kind of growth is seen in populations that reach their carrying capacity? So another very important term in ecology called carrying capacity. Okay, there are 4 questions. Okay, so I have received now 36 responses. So 91% of the respondents say that human beings have a positive growth rate. Is that right? Okay, indeed that is right. The human population is still increasing, right? So unless it stops increasing, it will have a positive growth rate. So growth rate is basically a measure of whether things are increasing or decreasing. Increasing means a positive growth rate. Therefore, humans do have a positive growth rate of under population right now. Second question, endangered species like snow leopard generally have what growth rate? Negative. Lot of overwhelming majority of you are saying it's a, about 70% are saying it's negative growth rate. Some of you are saying unknown, stagnant, 3 positive. Okay, so basically endangered species means that they have a negative growth rate. If it is true, endangered species must be decreasing over time. Okay, so now I don't know what is the actual Harish, do you want to say what is the actual definition of IUCN definition of endangered species? Is there a specific definition that they use?
They do. I'll post it in the chat box for people to look that up.
Yeah. Okay, then maybe one can compare with how the answers hold. Huh? You are going to do that right now? So Harish will post.
You can continue with the other discussions. I'll just post it immediately and get back.
Excellent. Okay. And then the another question: which of the following factors does not affect? So again, close to 90% of you are saying whether it's reptiles or amphibians, doesn't matter. All that matters is the birth rate, death rate, and immigration. Okay. So here I think did we make a mistake? So what have we picked, by the way? A lot of you have picked. It does not depend on. Okay, so a lot of you have picked it does not depend on whether it's reptiles or amphibians. Some of you have picked immigration doesn't affect population growth. So what do you again think of what is population growth? Population growth basically whether the numbers increase or decrease, whether the population numbers increase or decrease. If there is an immigration, what does it mean? Immigration means individuals are entering your population from outside, from a different population, right? So will that increase or decrease the populations? It typically increases population. Therefore, immigration does influence population growth, whereas whether it's a reptile or amphibian is not the factor that by itself decides the population growth. So okay, so the right answer for this is actually the orange, which is what majority of you have picked. And finally, what kind of growth is seen in populations that have reached their carrying capacity? Again, close to 50% of you are saying no growth, population stays at a constant size indefinitely. And then some of you are saying linear growth, depends on the kind of organisms. One of you are saying exponential growth. Okay, so this we will see in the end. So I will not answer you the question right away. So this is what, because there is a mixed. So although half of you are saying no growth, there is other half who are saying different answers, right? So there is no clear consensus here. Therefore, we will discuss this question today. Okay. So I'm going to close this right now. Close sharing this window. Thanks again for participating in this poll. I hope this made these polls made some sort of interactions possible with you all. It's not entirely monologue. Some good to see participation from all of you. Okay, so let me now try to explain how populations grow. Okay, so let's so to do this, I'm actually going to use so the basic question that the population ecology tries to understand is the following. So you have in nature there are lots and lots of species, right? And no species probably stays same throughout across time. Their numbers keep on changing, and we see lots of extinctions, right? And we also see lots of new species that come up. Okay, so the question that population biologists are very interested from a very fundamental biological point of view, as well as from an applied point of view. So if you are a conservation biologist, right, you want to know whether the population that you are interested in, it could be elephants, tigers, or it could be an insect. Or it could be locusts, it could be a pest that you want to know, or it could be a virus that is spreading across, right? So you want to know whether the population that you are studying how is it changing? Okay, what are the factors that influence population size over time? So that's a very fundamental question that population biologists are interested in. It has both fundamental implications as well as implications from the point of view of conservation, right? So that's the question we will also try to address today. Okay, so I hope that this is okay. So the basic question we're interested in, how populations grow or more generally change with time. One second, please. with time t. Okay, so this is the question that's of huge importance. Okay, so to understand this question, so some of the things I'm going to say are going to be fairly basic, and hopefully by the end of next 1 hour, even though you might know this, hopefully you would have gotten some new insights that you may not be aware of. Okay, so how do we go about thinking this question? Okay, so in ecology, let's say now, before one can of course go and do experiments, right? Let's say what I can do is I can look at some population, right? And then I can try to see how it is changing over time. If it is elephant population, I will have to really wait very, very long time and keep taking data of how many individuals are there in a population, and I plot them. So eventually we want a plot like this. Okay, so x-axis will be time, y-axis will be number of individuals, right? So we might get some data like this. Okay, or it could be a different, it might be something like this, we don't know. So we want to see how the population of a species that we are interested in will change over time, or in some other species maybe it might be something like this. So if it is something like this, we will be concerned, okay, why is this population reducing? If it is increasing, we want to know what factors are helping it increase. On the other hand, if it appears more stable like this, we want to know what factors stabilize the population, right? So we want to understand this. So of course, one can go do experiments and measure, and I might get any of these answers, right? So before we do these kind of experiments, it could be an experiment if it's in a lab. Is it possible to do experiments of population growth is it possible to do experiments? Of course it is possible. I don't have to study elephants and rhinos or tigers. I can study microbes, right? I can study yeast. I can plot the population size as a function of time. So population could be of any species. And in fact, using microorganisms, we can actually get a plot of this fairly quickly, right? Over a period of just a few days, we will be able to provide plots like this. However, in science in general, and especially in ecology, before we go and measure something, it is really important to have some expectation. Do I expect that this population will do an increasing trajectory or a decreasing trajectory? Will it be a stable trajectory? Okay, although it's really important to measure, it's also important to have a hypothesis of why it might be increasing, why it might be reducing, and therefore to make some calculations and to sort of have expectations is always very, very valuable. And what we will now try to do is, is it possible to arrive at some expectations of, what do we really expect? Okay, so now to make our life easy, let's assume that there is some organism, okay, and it sort of give rise to our offspring. Okay, after one generation. Okay, maybe I'll erase this. So if you wait for one generation, it will produce our offspring, right? See, one generation is a very nice time scale. It could be 20 minutes for many microorganisms. It could be a day, or for elephants it could be 20 to 30 years. For humans, it's again 20 to 30 years. So this is a sort of a time scale which is a general time scale. Instead of using something like years, this is much better to think of generations in biological populations. Okay, so if you assume that each organism produces our offspring at the end of one generation, so what will happen to each offspring in this group now? Each of them will now again, right? Each of the R offspring will now again produce R, another R, right? No, R offsprings. Okay. Likewise, the same thing will happen to these. Whatever the number R is. Each of them will again produce 3 offspring at the end of one generation again. So it goes on and goes on. Is it possible to now write down some expression that connects the number of organisms in the beginning? Let's say there were N0 organisms in the beginning. How many will we have at the end of one generation here? We will have N0 times R organisms. Is that right? Okay, now each of these N0 and R times would have given rise to R here, right? So each of these N0 times R would have R offspring. So therefore, at the end of second generation, how many do we have? Sorry, I'm getting cluttered here. N0 times R times R. So it basically becomes N0 R square. Okay, so you can sort of see a pattern here. I'm going to go to the next page now. So basically, if you write generation 1, let's say if we have N0 organisms, generation 2, we have R times N0 organisms. Generation 3, we have how many? Because everybody here had R offspring. So R times R N0, that becomes R square N0. And continue this again. Generation 4, you have R times this, R times R square N0. It is equal to R to the power of 3. And if you keep doing this, what do you get? You get that the number at the end of, let's say, T generations. What would that be? At the end of one generation, we had just one N0. At the end of 2, we had R times N0. At the end of 3, we had R square. At the end of 4, we had R cube. You can now see a relationship. At the end of 4 generation, you had R cube. So at the end of T generations, R power T minus 1 times N0. Is that right? This is how we expect the population to grow. Okay. Is everyone with me so far? Any questions on this before I go forward? So maybe what I will now do is I will just share you another slide now. Okay, now let's just now figure out what are the implications of this. Maybe I can stop there. So if you have any questions, please note them down. You can even post it on the chat right away. Let me finish a couple of more steps before I take those questions. Okay, so now let's now understand the implications of this. I have now written down, right? N of T is equal to R times T minus 1 times N0. This is the expectation, okay, that we have of how population will change over time. Let us consider a case, hypothetically assume that R was maybe 2, meaning at the end of one generation, this organism will have 2 offspring. Now let us calculate what will happen to N10. What would be N10? N10 will be 2 power 10 minus 1 times N0. Okay. What is 2 power 10 minus 1? 2 power 9 times N0. 2 power 9 is 512. So meaning at the end of, by 10th generation, the population, if it was at 100, it has now increased by a factor of 500 approximately. So if our calculations were right, my expectation is that by 10th generation, the population has increased by 500 times. Is that fine? And I can even now do a plot if this is correct. So I told you if I go back to the first page, this is what we want to do in the end, right? We want to know how N changes with time. We want to have some expectations. It doesn't matter if the expectation is right or wrong. It's important to have the expectation. Okay. N and time, if I were to plot this, do you know how this will look like? If you were to plot this, this is 1, if you just take these numbers 1, 2, 3, and so on, okay, what you find is that it will increase like this in a rapid way. It's also called an exponential curve. So I'm sort of assuming most probably you're all familiar with this, but it's totally fine if you're not familiar with this, but I would imagine that probably many of you are familiar with this. So this is what we have, what is called an exponential growth. Now let's look at another possibility. Okay, so we had this again, the same formula, and T is RT minus 1 times N0, right? Let's say R was half, meaning at the end of one generation, you only reproduce half individuals. How is that even possible, right? Okay, one way to think about this is that, if there are two individuals, only one of them will reproduce. One of them will not be able to reproduce. That's one way to think about the fact that R is less than 1. If this is true, then what will be, let's say, after 10 generations again? And 10 will then become half power 10 minus 1 times N0, which basically means is N0 divided by 512. So what is happening in this case? If R0 was half instead of 2, the population has it increased or decreased? It has now actually decreased by a factor of about 500. So you can again make this plot. Okay, N versus time. And what you will find is that, if you were to plot this, you will find a curve like this. So this is called the exponential decay. Or in fact, which will eventually cause what? Extinction. For example, if N0 was 500, by the end of 10 generations, there is basically nobody in the population. Okay, so this is what, what we have done is, we have started with a simple assumption that each individual reproduces R individuals at every generation. And if you now keep track of it, if R is, let's say 2, we find that these numbers will grow exponentially rather rapidly. If R was half, these numbers will decay rapidly and will reach an extinction. We do know that in biological populations, extinction will occur, right? In fact, many populations do go extinct. However, do we actually find that the populations grow exponentially? Do we have evidence for this? Does anyone know any evidence for exponential growth of populations? Okay, this is where I will sort of okay. I will now stop this. I will now share. Oh, what happened to my PowerPoint? Are you able to see my desktop now? Are you able to see what I'm showing now? Can somebody confirm, or is it gone? Okay, you can see. So if you okay, basically I have shown you using this example. So I think you're saying my entire screen now, right? So I can, when I switch between windows, you will also see my switching. So I have shown you several possibilities. Now, populations can grow exponentially, population can decay and go extinct. So now, is there any empirical evidence for either of them? And how do we really understand this? Let us, before we even go there, isn't it, is it really possible that populations can keep on increasing like this as shown in this graph? Or will there be a time they cannot actually continue in this? Is it actually possible that population can just keep on growing as shown in this slide, in this page 3? So the calculation I have shown here shows that nt is r power t minus 1 times n0, right? If you now apply this formula for, let's say, r is equal to 2, it shows that populations will keep on increasing. And even if I assume r is equal to 1.1, it will show the same thing. It will just keep on increasing. You know, r has to be just greater than 1. As long as r is greater than 1, these numbers will just keep on increasing. Okay. So Ritu Mandal says that yes, this is true, but only when the resources are unlimited. That's a very, very good point, and that's also the correct answer. Why is that? We are assuming that, if you go back to this slide here, I assume that an organism makes r offspring, and each of the organism offspring again makes r offspring each, and so on, right? For this to be true in every generation, the only way this can happen is that every organism at every generation must have, whatever the resources they require. Only then they will be able to reproduce at the same levels as their ancestors did. Okay, so therefore, to ensure that everybody is indeed producing r offspring at every generation, the only way this can happen is if there is unlimited amount of resources. Okay, now of course in nature you will never really have unlimited resources, right? Does it mean will you ever observe exponential growth? Is it even meaningful to have such an expectation? So Ritu Mandal says that we need unlimited resources to observe exponential growth, but there is no exponential growth. There is no unlimited resource in the world. The resources are limited in the world. So that means we should never see this. Is that right? Or maybe do you think we will see it in some circumstances? Yes, to what? In experimental condition we can see. Okay, so in experimental condition, if you somehow magically provide unlimited resource, will you find? Okay, in vitro conditions. Okay, so what about wild? Will you see this in the wild? In nature it might be seen for a limited period of time. Okay, excellent. Okay, very good. So let's see if there is any evidence at all for such an expectation. Okay, so first of all, as somebody rightly said, we can observe this in experimental conditions. This is an example of paramecium grown over a period of 6 days. As you can see, it's doubling every day. 0 becomes 1, 1 becomes 2, 2, no, 0 doesn't become 1, sorry, 1 becomes 2, 2 becomes 4, 4 becomes 8, 8 becomes 16, and so on. Okay, and in fact, if you now plot the number of paramecium as a function of time, it does show the theoretically expected pattern. Okay, but as Akhil Sadiq as well as Rintu and others are pointing out, will this be true forever? No, even in experimental conditions, what will happen is that the resources are not unlimited. You have given some resources to organisms. As you increase as the number of organisms increase, the resource available for every one of them reduces over time, right? So we cannot see this forever. Okay, so by the way, I asked you one more question. Is it actually possible to see this in the wild? Okay, so this is an example of data from American bison. Okay, so between 1902 and 1915, okay, so American bisons, actually you can actually go for much longer periods of time as well. Okay, so this is over just a period of 15 years. It's not huge, but in this period, initially the bisons were really, really small in number because they were almost driven towards extinction. But however, various measures came in, and their numbers began to increase. So if you look at the initial 15 period starting from low 20s in early 1900s, the way they increased up to 250 and around that number, in fact, the best fit for such a curve actually looks like an exponential curve. Okay, so not only do we see such an exponential curve for microbial organisms like paramecium and E. coli and so on, we can also see this in the wild in the very initial phase of the growth, as somebody rightly pointed out. Okay, and again, we don't have to depend on other animals. If you look at humans, the growth of human populations of recently, there has been, for a large period of time, the growth wasn't exponential, but of recently, remember, note that the y-axis is a logarithmic scale. Okay, which means if it was a straight line, the phase where my mouse is now moving, that's also an exponential growth. Okay, and then this growth rate itself has been accelerating, and in fact, over the last 200 years, there has been a massive exponential growth of human populations. Okay, and Anand Kumar is pointing out that early succession of species tend to show exponential growth when there is abundance of resources. You're absolutely right. I fully agree with you. It's a very good point. So, exponential growth is indeed observed in the wild and in human species, in laboratory species of microorganisms, basically in any species in the initial phase when they are smaller in number, that does really happen. But it doesn't mean that they will continue in that fashion forever. So for example, this is again paramecium density as a function of time. This actually reaches saturation. It doesn't continue growing exponentially indefinitely. So how do we understand, and this seems like a very commonly observed phenomenon. These populations do not grow forever exponentially, they do saturate. And likewise, this is an example of Daphnia in an experimental setup. Okay, and then this is an example of fur seals again. Their numbers, y-axis shows their numbers in thousands. Initially, they were increasing rapidly, but eventually they are saturated to a stable population size. So, so you do see this stabilization of populations, which means there is a limit to growth. And as you have all rightly figured out, this limits to growth comes from the fact that the resources are limited. Okay, now let me now go back to my, my notebook where I can write nicely. Okay. Page. Okay, so now what I want to discuss are a few points which are sometimes not slightly ignored. Okay, so we learned a few quantities, right? Growth rate. So how do we measure growth rate? So how do we measure growth rate? So here I want to emphasize one thing. When we in ecology, of course, in generally in all of the sciences, it is not only important to have a conceptual understanding of the of various terms, we must also have a quantitative understanding. So if somebody did give you population sizes, N1, N2, N3, N4, right? N whatever T, right? How do you find growth rate? Okay, so growth rate, if you can maybe denote this by G, you can compute this from looking at the population at time T, subtract the population at the previous generation and divide by the length of the generation. So this is it's a very simple calculation, but important to be able to do. If this number is positive, then we have increasing populations. And if this number is negative, we have decreasing populations. And I want to emphasize that this G is a measure of growth rate at the level of populations. Okay, there's another quantity that's also equally important. It's called per capita growth rate. Okay, so what is per capita growth rate? It's basically, let me denote a symbol R for that. Per capita growth rate is growth rate at the level of individuals. This is at the level of population. This is at the level of individual. Sometimes it's also called intrinsic growth rate. And it is closely connected to the idea of fitness, because it truly measures the, how many offspring an individual is giving rise to. How do we calculate this? Exactly same formula as G, but you divide it by G. You divide by that population size. Okay, you find the population level growth rate and divide that number by N. Okay, and this is, I find that understanding this per capita growth rate is really important, and it actually helps us clarify a lot of points. Growth rate and per capita growth rate, right? So these are the two quantities that came up repeatedly in the two questions that two student volunteers have prepared. Okay, so if you compare the two, if growth rate is positive, right, then then this will also be positive, right? If R is greater than 0, what does that mean? Every individual has more than 0 offspring per generation. Okay, and if R is less than 0, okay, that means that the population, at the level of individuals, the number of offspring are actually reducing over time. Okay, and therefore this is an instance of increasing population size. This is an instance of decreasing population per time. Okay, so these are really important. This is a subtle and important distinction between growth rate and per capita growth rate, and it's important to make sure you all understand this well. So now let us understand how do we, so in these calculations that we did in the beginning, right? In these calculations, we argued that the population size grows like this. How do we now capture the fact that in real populations that's not going to be the case? In real populations, the resources are unlimited. So I'm going to ask you the following question now. So I'm going to give you 4 choices. I'm going to give you 4 graphs. Okay. Graph A, I want to, so resources are now, let me give you 2 instances. Resources are unlimited. If that is the case, I want to know which of the following graphs is correct. If I were to write R as a function of population size, if the resources are unlimited, which of the following 2 is correct? So is it black line or the blue line? Can you answer your, can you give me answer in the chat box? So let's call the, this is option A. This is option B. Okay, so for 4 answers, all are saying black or A. Okay. And what about B? What does B constitute? So it's actually correct answer. This will indeed this is limited resource. Okay, so the main difference between a context of limited resource and unlimited resource is that this per capita growth rate now reduces, as a function of population size when the resources are limited. So what are the reasons? What are the sort of, can you be a bit more specific about what causes this declining curve? Intra-specific competition. Can you be a bit competition for what? Food, okay. What resources? What is the difference between food and resources? Space for living. Okay, that's good now. That's okay. No, there are more specific answers I'm getting now. One is reducing food was one specific answer. So reducing food causes increased competition. Okay. Now tell me, when the population size increases, why will mates reduce? That is not very clear to me. Why will mate choice reduce when the population size is increasing? It's good to know if there are more individuals, there is a higher chance of finding a mate, right? Is there an answer for why did you think that mate and mate choices will reduce? Not clear to me. Maybe you can give me an answer. So I will. So the space for living, I can see why it reduces. Space is reducing. Unable to produce fertile offspring irrespective of available resources. Okay. Oh, they want to stop others from mating. But as long as I'm reproducing, why should I care about others? Okay, I can actually stop others from doing, but by the costs of doing so. Costs of mating partner might reduce the growth. Competition for, see, when the population size increases, males and females increase proportionately, right? So why will there a competition for mates at higher population size? That's not clear to me. Okay, that's fine. Okay, diseases might increase with population size. Again, it's not clear to me why. You need to explain why it might increase disease. Competition for resources I have already written here. Resources and food. Okay, so somebody used a word called density dependent growth. So this B is also called density dependent growth. So what does that mean? So basically, if you plot R, which is the intrinsic growth rate, and N, which is the population size or the population density, right? When this R is decreasing with N, meaning it has dependence on the density. Okay, whereas this A will be called density independent. Okay, so basically, I just want to emphasize, you must distinguish between a broad process like intra-specific competition, density dependent growth or density independent growth, and then competition. And you should think of it as in some sense again different levels at which you are describing the causes. For example, density dependent growth is a generic term whenever R depends on N. Okay, and this can happen for a number of reasons. And one class of reason why it happens is intra-specific competition. And intra-specific competition can again happen for a number of reasons. It can happen for reducing food. It can happen because of space is reducing, and maybe the fighting behavior between individuals is increasing. So there are many reasons and very many mechanisms that again cause intra-specific competition. Okay, so when you are explaining phenomenon, try to think of at what level are you thinking. Okay, that's very important to have some clarity on that. Okay, so we know in the process we have introduced more words now: density independent growth, density dependent growth. These are terms I have seen students get confused very easily, and make sure you understand them well. These are very basic concepts in ecology. So whenever the per capita growth rate depends on density, we call them density dependent growth. If it's a declining function, we call it a negative density dependent growth. Is it possible to have an opposite effect? Let's just think of, so basically the purpose of this is, to come up with possibilities, right? Is it possible to have a positive density dependent? Seven. So let me now write down this possibility R with N, which is, let's say, increasing like this. Is it possible? Under what circumstances is it possible? When there is, that's excellent. Whenever there is facilitation, presence of one helps other to grow further. Okay. Do you know an example of facilitative interaction? There are lots of them. So for example, if for example, in semi-arid landscapes, there are plants which are sparsely distributed, right? Consider two cases where the two plants are very nearby, and consider a case when there is a single plant. So what happens is that if there are already a bunch of plants, you would imagine that there is competition for water, which is already limited. But however, the reverse can also happen. If there are plants, this is called nurse plant effect, whatever I'm going to explain now. If there are already some plants here, if there is a new seed that comes and falls here, it might get shade which you will not find here. So there is an increased amount of shade if you are already near some number of plants, right? And then therefore there is, because there are already some plants that underneath soil might have some amount of moisture which is more than what is present in a bare area. So therefore presence of plants, some amount of plants, actually enhances the germination probability of a seed, enhances the survival of a seedling, and therefore the probability of it becoming an adult plant. Okay, so this curve is possible. But tell me one thing, is it possible to have this curve going like this forever? This per capita growth rate keeps on increasing with them. Is it possible? It never reduces. Okay, that's usually not possible. What happens is the competition will eventually kick in. So all the facilitation effects that I just mentioned are possible for excuse me, only for small sizes. Eventually what happens is you will actually again turn back because the competition takes over. Okay, so you can have facilitation for low values, and then it reduces. Let me go back. So contrast the two, right? Here the per capita growth rate was decreasing continuously as a function of n, and the value of population where it hits 0, it's called the carrying capacity. It's a term that came up in the, okay. And what happens at carrying capacity? What's the per capita growth rate? It is 0, right? So which means what is the population growth rate? So remember that the population growth rate G is per capita growth rate into N. If per capita growth rate is 0, what's the population growth rate? That will also be 0. Okay. So there was some ambiguity among a lot of you. What will happen to population growth rate when at the carrying capacity? So at carrying capacity, the R will be 0 and G will also be 0. Okay. So this explains why that is 0. Okay, now let's go to the next one. Here the effect looks very different the way I have written now. It's increasing. Okay, again, this is probably carrying capacity K. When you are above at the carrying capacity, you hit you hit maximum population size. Okay. On the other hand, you have another value here. Let's call that M. Okay. What do you think is M? So K is at K, R is equal to 0, right? Which means population growth rate is also 0. So I hope you all know, remember the distinction between R and G. R means is at the level of individuals, whereas G is at the level of populations. Okay. And again, if the population size is, oh sorry, the thickness suddenly increased. Let's say I'm at a population size n, m. What is the value of R there? It's again 0. Even there, the population growth rate is 0. But what is the difference between m and k? Do you understand the difference between the population size m and population size k? Are both carrying capacity, because at both the values of population size, there is no growth in the population? I hope you understand the question, right? So K, K here was carrying capacity where the population, doesn't grow anymore. Now I have 2 points where the per capita growth rate, intrinsic growth rate becomes 0, M and K. But is there a difference between M and K? But both of them, R is 0, G is 0. But is there still a difference? Yes, of course, population sizes are different. Fine. Anything else? Conceptually, is there any difference between the two? Slope of the graph. Okay, now tell me more about that. So what do I do with the slope of the graph?
So one denotes an increasing part of the graph, and the other talks about the decreasing. So which means that at k, if I have a decreasing graph, it sort of implies that my population is going to extinction if these conditions prolong. And if it's a positive graph, then I know my population is flourishing.
Okay.
And those conditions are quite apt for whatever.
Okay, somebody also, thank you very much. So some of you know this concept very well, so it's great. I'll just explain it to everybody else because this is very interesting. So the main difference, one way to think about difference between M and K without using any jargon is as follows. Imagine that I'm now in a forest patch. Think of maybe these animals as some small mammals, and their current population size is M. Okay. Now, strictly, if it is at M, will it increase or decrease? Neither will happen, right? Because the growth rate is 0. There will be neither an increase nor a decrease in the population size. Okay. However, imagine that due to a bad climatic event, an extreme weather event, the small mammal population size suddenly had more deaths than the births. What happens in such a case? After the end of that extreme event, what will be the number of individuals? It will be now less than m. Do you all agree with that? It would have come somewhere here. Is that right? What happens at that m? What happens at population size? What has happened is that at that value of population size, the per capita growth rate is now negative. Okay. Per capita growth rate is negative, which means capital G, such G, the population growth rate is also negative. So on an average, now at this size, everybody is reproducing less than the number of deaths that are happening, which means I can write an arrow to indicate that it will now reduce even further. The population will reduce even further. And once the reduction happens again, same. It's actually now even more negative. The per capita growth rate is even more negative. It will reduce further and eventually reach a point of extinction. Which means if a population was at size m, any extreme event that reduces the population size will actually make it go extinct. Now let us look at the converse scenario, which is another type of extreme event which led to an extra number of births than deaths. Then we will have population size above m at the end of that extreme event. In that case, what's the per capita growth rate now? The per capita growth rate is, because of those facilitative interactions we discussed, because of that, even though population size actually increased, the per capita growth rate has also increased. That means there's a net population growth now, which means the population will grow. I am writing now an arrow to indicate that there is now a growth in the population. If it grows and comes here, what happens again now? It's again a large and positive intrinsic growth rate will increase again. So it will increase as long as the per capita growth rate is positive, right? It will keep on increasing until it hits K. So even though the initial population was capital M, some event increased the number of births more than the deaths, and that in turn led to a series of positive interaction events that eventually took them up to carrying capacity K. And why doesn't it grow beyond that? Because of the competition now. Competition has now overtaken. Competition has overtaken. Even if there was an event that led to more births, you would reach here. But again, there's a negative growth rate now, negative per capita growth rate. So you can now come back. Any increase will always be pushed back to K. Okay. So this is what happens if you have a combination of positive interaction for low population sizes and eventually negative interactions for high population size. Okay. So these kind of effects are also called, Allee effect. In fact, it's actually called strong Allee effect. It's called strong Allee effect because this positive interactions kick in only when the population size is above M. So M is also called the minimum viable population. So if you start, so it means, this has very important implications, right? In terms of conservation. So if you want a system where there might be some populations, depending on the processes, they might, for example, again, that the example of, dry landscape I gave you. If it's an absolutely dry landscape, introducing a few plants sporadically will lead to death of each and every individual. Only when I introduce them in some clustered minimum size, only can they actually grow and they become viable, because that's when the positive interactions kick in for them to survive, and that's when they grow, until again the competitive negative interactions again overtake, and they will all then stabilize at carrying capacity K. Okay, so this is called the example of strong Allee effect. where you need to have a minimum population size for the system to survive. Okay, so now let me go back to my slides. Are you able to see this? So I have shown you these things, and I have described population size, population density, growth rate, the idea of growth rate, per capita growth rate, or intrinsic growth rate. Remember the distinction between growth rate and per capita growth rate and carrying capacity. Okay, and the effect that I described is that of the effect of this minimum population size that you need for a population to survive. Those effects typically kick in when they are really small in number. In fact, one of the predominant mechanism that by which this minimum population size is necessity is because of actually one of the reasons you gave earlier, which is that of mate access. When the population size is really small, it's very easy to have sex bias in one direction or the other. In such a case, finding a mate actually becomes difficult for the for individuals who are larger in number. So in such a case, unless the population is above a certain threshold size, they are likely to go extinct. Another reason why this may again happen is small population sizes are more prone to effects of stochasticity. Demographic stochasticity, by which, what is demographic stochasticity? So the birth and death are not deterministic events. Like when I was writing the equations, I sort of made it like every individual will reproduce R number of individuals, and then they will all die, and then every one of the surviving offspring will again give rise to R offspring, and so on, right? So that's of course a very deterministic picture of how birth and death happens. But that's not the way the real world works. There is a lot of stochasticity in birth and death, and the stochasticity is very high when in small population sizes. And if that population is less than some threshold value, again they can just go extinct. That's so these are some of the reasons why Allee effects happen. And if Allee effect is present, there are many ways to sort of measure them. For example, you usually expect that the initial population so for example, this is an example of probability of extinction on the y-axis on the left hand side, and the right hand side is initial population size. So if there was no Allee effect, the probability of extinction curve looks like this as a function of population size. Basically, as we increase the population size, the probability of rapid extinction, I think it's actually the inverse. I think there's a mistake in the labeling here. It's actually probability of I think survival must have been the correct on the y-axis. So probability of survival increases rapidly with initial population size if there was no Allee effect. However, if there is an Allee effect, there is a very high chance of extinction, but that extinction reduces only when the numbers are above a threshold value. In this case, the threshold is around 50 or so. And another way to measure Allee effect in the field is, imagine if there are many different patches of populations. Okay, if you can, let's say, if you can create experimentally different patch sizes of population, or it could be a plant, a small plant, or it could be an experimental condition where you create patches of organisms. And if you find that a minimum patch size is required for the populations to survive, that's another evidence for Allee effect. In this example, what this is trying to show is, if the patch size is less than some value RC, these patches will shrink and collapse to extinction, whereas those above RC will expand and increase in size, and then they'll expand. And the third way of knowing whether a system actually has Allee effect is looking at the frequency distribution of population sizes found across various landscapes. This will require a really large amount of sampling and data efforts across various places. For example, if you find bimodal distributions of population density, then what does that mean? That means that large populations will survive and small populations will go extinct, and therefore are more likely to find either no populations or a moderately high population size. So this provides another evidence for Allee effect. And in fact, if in fact, there are some species where people have found evidence for Allee effect. So if you remember, if I can go back to the notes I showed you, so this was the graph I plotted, right? An Allee effect, the per capita growth rate must show this blue trajectory. It's negative below a population size, it's positive, and then becomes again 0 and negative. So in fact, there is a very similar pattern found for starfish. So they measured the per capita population change as a function of density for starfish density. And they actually find a similar pattern and evidence for Allee effect. So here, the minimum population size would be somewhere here. Minimum or viable population size would be around 200 to 500. I'm just eyeballing the figure here. This provides evidence for existence of Allee effects in many species. And in fact, the people have found evidence for Allee effects in many species. These are different taxonomic groups. The way to read this, this is terrestrial arthropods. And the size of circle represents, is there evidence for Allee effects? And the different, I'll just use, sorry. I'm sorry, I'll try this again. So these are all different mechanisms by which Allee effects can occur. For example, cooperative defense. The cooperative defense is a case of where a few prey organisms cluster together and potentially scare predator away. Okay, now that's possible only if there are certain minimum number of prey to be able to scare predator away, right? So therefore, it means there's an Allee effect like behavior again. No, there is evidence for such a cooperative defense in mammals, birds, to some extent in fish, and to a lesser extent in these two. Okay, and then another one is cooperative feeding. Apparently, there's evidence for terrestrial arthropods for cooperative feeding, but not so much in others. And then mate limitation. As I mentioned, when populations are very small in numbers, finding mates becomes very difficult, and there is quite a bit of evidence in terrestrial arthropods. I think it's aquatic invertebrates and also in plants, but to a much lesser extent in mammals and birds. So this is sort of a summary of various studies showing that there might be indeed the small population negative growths, which leads to Allee effect in various taxonomic groups. Okay, so I'm going to stop here. So I'm sort of, it's 4:50 now, it's taken a long time. So I'm going to stop here and open up for any further questions and discussion. So much. So basically, to summarize the sort of my session today, I have described the basic idea of ecological hierarchical organization. And a couple of basic concepts in population ecology. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. So feel free to ask questions now. Again, post them in chat. So Sultan Nazir had mentioned that M is unstable. That's correct. So M would be called an unstable equilibrium. And Swati had mentioned how when population reaches M, the population will increase further. I think what you mean is when population goes beyond M, it will increase further, while beyond K, it will actually decrease. Very good. Absolutely right. Positive growth rate at M and negative at K. Absolutely correct. Is there any other species is there any other species that shows Allee effect? So I showed you one graph and see that this basically this 1 second. I mean, basically this is am I sharing my screen right now? No. Oh, sorry. Are you seeing my screen now?
Yes, we should.
So this is sort of table that sort of captures various evidence for Allee effect. Not as rigorously as the previous, let's say, see, this is very, very clear, right? This pattern. Maybe not as clear, but this is a meta-analysis of studies that looked at evidence for Allee effect. So for example, there is bigger circle means more evidence. So there is a lot of evidence for plants showing Allee effect mediated by mate limitation. There is evidence for aquatic invertebrates showing Allee effect via mate limitation again. There is evidence for birds showing Allee effect mediated by cooperative defense. Same for mammals, likewise. These are all the various mechanisms of Allee effects, and this is the strength of evidence across taxonomic groups. Is that clear? Rudranath has a question. I want to know that is per capita growth rate same in both J-shaped and linear. When linear will occur? Okay, I don't think I understood the question.
Vishu, I think he wants to ask, in what conditions will you observe exponential versus linear growth of population?
Oh, J is the exponential, is it? Is that what you meant? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, see, I just want to clarify one thing. It's very easy to confuse this. Okay, let me just write that. Let me add another page here. Are you able to see this page? No, I think I haven't shared. Yes, I'll just share it now. See, it's very easy to confuse between two different things. One is, okay, there are different graphs that I was plotting. Okay, one is how do populations change with time? Okay, and that I initially showed was an exponential growth, right? And then I also showed that when resources become limiting, population show this kind of a behavior. This is population size versus time. However, when I was plotting per capita growth rate, I wasn't plotting them as a function of time. I was actually plotting them as a function of population size, because time is irrelevant. So for exponential growth, the per capita growth rate will basically be a constant line, meaning at every population size, the number of offspring produced by an individual is always going to be the same. That's the basic idea here. It doesn't matter how many other individuals are there. This individual will always produce R number of offspring. However, in this case, what happens is as the numbers increase, it actually reduces. Per capita growth rate reduces with population size. So this is the case when you have the sigmoidal curve, J versus S curve, when the per capita growth rate shows this kind of a behavior. Okay, I hope that's clear now. Any other questions? So are there any no more questions? Any other questions? Are we all done? I hope you all learned something interesting and useful. Feel free to email any questions that you may have later also. I want to thank both Harish and Mihir for helping out today. They're both Harish is a postdoc at CES and Mihir is a I think I'm sorry, you're project assistant. No, Mihir, is that right?
No, I'm doing my PhD with Maria.
Oh, you joined just last year, no? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh. Can we induce early effect in any species of choice by reducing the number of mates? So you're well, I guess you can if you reduce that. If you selectively reduce the number of mates at lower population densities, yes, you can. But that would be a very artificial thing to do. Any other questions? Okay, great. Thank you very much then. I'm going to end the meeting now. Again, thanks everyone, and thanks to Harish and Meher.